There's a certain pressure that comes with pretending everything is fine when, deep down, everything is falling apart. My name is Elena Mayer. On the surface, my life might seem perfect. A caring husband, two stepsons who appear well adjusted, and a home that always feels like it's being lived in. But looks can be deceiving. It wasn't always like this. When I first married Edwin, I thought I had found the perfect partner. He was grounded, focused, and dependable, a rock I could lean on. But somewhere along the way, he transformed into a shadow of himself. Work took over, leaving me with only polite exchanges and brief conversations rather than real connection. It wasn't that he stopped caring, but it felt like he poured all his energy into providing for us while leaving nothing for our relationship. Then there were the boys, Yahir and Nixon. Yahir, Edwin's oldest, had always been polite but distant. He was quiet, observant, and at times a little too intense for comfort. Nixon, on the other hand, was energetic, sharp, and always knew how to get under Yahir's skin. Despite their differences, they shared a closeness that made me feel like an outsider. I made a concerted effort to connect with them, especially with Yahir, since he was almost an adult, and I knew how important it was for us to get along. But no matter what I did, family dinners, offering help with schoolwork, or simply asking about his day, there was always a barrier. It was like he didn't fully trust me, and I couldn't figure out why. Edwin didn't seem to notice the distance, or perhaps he just didn't want to. His response to everything was always patience. "They'll warm up to you," he once said, as if time could fix something that felt irreparably broken. So I waited, but waiting only led to frustration, which then turned into resentment. One day, while folding laundry, I realized several pairs of my underwear were missing. At first, I thought they had just been misplaced, maybe mixed up with Edwin's clothes or left behind in the dryer. But after looking around, I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't until I saw Yahir hurrying out of the laundry room one afternoon, his face turning red when he saw me, that my suspicion grew. He mumbled something about needing clean socks before quickly walking away. I wanted to brush it off, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I decided to check his room while he was out. I felt sick doing it, but the nagging thought wouldn't leave me. What I found confirmed my suspicions. Several pairs of my underwear, including the ones I thought had gone missing, stuffed in the back of his closet under a pile of old clothes. My stomach twisted. I should have walked away, waited for Edwin to come home, and let him handle it. But instead, I stayed. I stayed long enough to see Yahir walk in and freeze when he saw me holding the evidence. The look on his face, shame, fear, and something else I couldn't quite place, made my heart race. Neither of us spoke for what seemed like an eternity. Then finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I needed something that felt real." His words hit me harder than I expected. He looked so desperate, so lost, that I wasn't sure whether to be angry or heartbroken. I told him it couldn't happen again, that it crossed a line. But instead of demanding answers or storming out, I did something else. I asked if he needed help, To this day, I still don't know why I said it. Maybe it was guilt for not being the mother figure he needed. Or maybe it was my own loneliness seeking a way to feel needed. Either way, I regretted it almost immediately. Yahir looked at me with wide eyes, unable to believe what he was hearing. When I clarified that I meant I'd help by buying him something appropriate to fulfill whatever need he had, he smiled. A week later, I went through with it. I visited a store I never thought I'd step foot in and bought something I thought would solve the issue. Handing it to him felt awkward, but he seemed grateful. For a while, I thought that was the end of it, that everything had returned to normal. But then came the text. It was late, and Edwin was out of town for work again. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Yahir's name, I thought it might be something simple, maybe a question about groceries or whether his dad had called. But it wasn't. It was a video. My heart raced as I opened it, and I immediately knew what I was seeing. Yahir using the toy I had bought for him. I should have deleted it, blocked his number, and told Edwin everything. But I froze, and then I pressed play. I don't know how many times I watched it before reality set in. The next day, Yahir claimed it was an accident, that he had meant to send it to someone else. But the way he looked at me told me everything. I knew it wasn't a mistake, and the way my stomach twisted whenever I thought about it told me that I wasn't as unaffected as I had convinced myself. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just flattered by the attention after feeling invisible for so long. But deep down, I knew better. As much as I wanted to stop what was happening, part of me didn't. I tried to put the video behind me, to pretend it never happened, but it stayed with me. Every time I looked at Yahir, flashes of that night crept into my mind. For the next few days, I avoided being alone with him. I'd make sure the kitchen was tidy before he arrived home, retreat to my room early, and stay busy with small tasks. It worked for a while, but Yahir noticed. Did I do something wrong? He asked one evening, leaning against the counter while I made dinner. I felt his eyes on me, waiting for me to break. My hands fumbled with the knife, and I had to remind myself to breathe. No, I said, forcing a smile. Why would you think that? He shrugged but didn't look convinced. Later that night, he sent another message. This time it wasn't a video, just a text. I didn't mean to make things weird. I swear, I just wanted to show you I was grateful. That's all. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding as I typed and deleted several responses before settling on something neutral. It's fine. I'm glad it's helping. But it wasn't fine. We both knew it. Over the next few days, things changed. Yahir wasn't just polite anymore. He was attentive. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offering help even when I said I didn't need it. He complimented my hair, my outfits, even the way I laughed. It wasn't over the top, but it was enough to make my skin flush. The worst part was that I liked it. For the first time in months, someone was paying attention to me, looking at me like I mattered, like I was wanted, and that terrified me. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that it was just a phase for him and he'd eventually lose interest. But one night, as I folded laundry, another message popped up on my phone. This time, it wasn't words. It was another video. I froze, my hands shaking as I tapped the screen. I shouldn't have watched it, but I did. And this time, I didn't stop after the first play. I tried to tell myself it was another mistake, that he had sent it to the wrong person. But when I looked at him the next morning, the look in his eyes told me everything. This wasn't an accident. Yahir was pushing boundaries, and I wasn't stopping him. The next day, he brought it up. "Did you see what I sent you?" I pretended to be busy folding towels, avoiding eye contact. "You didn't mean to send it to me," I said quickly, trying to end the conversation. But he wouldn't let it go. "What if I did?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yahir, this isn't funny," I said. "I'm not joking." He stepped closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. "I don't want things to be weird," he said. He spoke softly. "Between us, I just feel like we understand each other better than anyone else in this house." His words hit me harder than I expected, because deep down, I knew he was right. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him to stop, to set clear boundaries and walk away. But instead, I allowed the moment to linger. And that's when I realized I wasn't as in control of this situation as I thought. If you're still here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I should have trusted my instincts the moment Edwin told me he and Nixon had to leave early for the family event, leaving Yahir and me to drive separately later. I felt that unsettling sensation in my stomach. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. It was just a 5-hour, maybe 6-hour drive, and we would meet up with the rest of the family. But the tension was still there, hanging between us like a weight I couldn't shake. After 2 hours, Yahir offered to take the wheel, and I let him. I needed a break, or at least that's what I told myself, while I watched him focus on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. I couldn't stop thinking about how much he had changed lately, looking older, more confident, and I hated myself for noticing. When the rain began, I tried to focus on anything other than him. The wipers scraped across the windshield, and the car crept along in traffic. I kept checking the time, calculating how much later we'd be. I didn't want to stop for the night, but I knew I didn't have the energy to keep driving. We pulled into a small motel off the highway. It wasn't much, just a place to sleep, but when the receptionist told us they only had one room, my stomach flipped. I almost said no, almost told her we should just keep driving through the rain. But I didn't. I convinced myself it was fine, just for one night. But when we entered the room and saw the single bed, I realized I had made a mistake. I distracted myself by unpacking a bag I didn't really need to, brushing my hair longer than necessary, and changing into the simplest pajamas I could find, hoping it would ease whatever tension had been building all day. It didn't. Yahir sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone as if he hadn't noticed how close we were. But I noticed. I felt his presence in every moment. Then he spoke. His words weren't complicated, just an observation about how much I did for everyone and how no one ever asked how I was doing. I tried to laugh it off, tried to act like it didn't strike at the heart of me. But when I turned around and saw how he was looking at me, as if I was someone worth noticing, I froze. I should have stopped it then. I should have said good night and turned off the lights. Instead, I sat beside him. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was him. But suddenly, the space between us was gone. It didn't feel wrong at first. It felt like being wanted, like being seen. I told myself it was a mistake as soon as it was over, promised myself it wouldn't happen again. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I already knew I was lying. The drive the next morning was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Yahir sat beside me, quiet but calm. Too calm. I hated him for it, even as a part of me envied how easily he seemed to move past what had just happened. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The way it felt, the way I didn't hesitate. Edwin greeted us with a hug when we finally arrived. As if nothing had changed, Nixon barely looked up from his phone. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. I felt exposed, like the truth was written on my face. I avoided Yahar as much as I could, but it didn't matter. Every time our eyes met, I felt that pull again. And worse, I could tell he felt it too. I told myself it was over. I told myself I would pretend it never happened and move on. But Yahar didn't let me. He didn't push or corner me. Instead, he lingered. He stayed close, offering to help with dishes, finding excuses to brush past me in the kitchen. And every time, my resolve cracked just a little more. The worst part was how easy it became to justify. Edwin barely noticed me anymore. Too busy, too tired, too distracted. And Yahir, he noticed everything. But I wasn't the only one who noticed. It started small. Nixon making comments about how Yahir and I seemed so close lately, asking why he was always around me, why we kept disappearing after dinner, to clean up or rearrange the garage. I brushed him off, laughed at his jokes, and told myself he was just being nosy. But the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. Then one night, everything changed. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Yahir had left an hour earlier, but Nixon stayed behind, scrolling through his phone at the counter. I was halfway to my room when he called after me. "I saw you." I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear him. I told myself he couldn't know. He couldn't have seen anything. But when I turned around, Nixon's face was calm, too calm. He didn't say it outright, but he didn't need to. All he said was that he wasn't planning to tell Edwin. Not yet. I felt a brief wave of relief. Then the fear set in. He didn't need to tell Edwin to destroy me. One wrong word, one wrong look, and everything I had tried to protect would come crashing down. I wanted to believe he would keep my secret. I wanted to believe he wouldn't go there. But the way he smiled before walking out of the kitchen told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For weeks, I thought I had control. I convinced myself no one had noticed the tension between Yahir and me. I told myself we were careful, too careful for anyone to suspect anything. But Nixon was smarter than I gave him credit for. He'd always been observant, picking up on details others missed. At first, I brushed off his questions and teasing as harmless. But then it changed. I was in the laundry room folding clothes when my phone buzzed. A message from Nixon. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. It wasn't words. It was a video. My pulse hammered in my ears as I tapped the screen. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. Yahir and I, caught in a moment I had tried so hard to forget. I couldn't breathe. Nixon must have been outside that night, listening, recording, and now he had proof. I wanted to scream, cry, storm into his room and beg him to delete it. But before I could even think clearly, another message came through. We need to talk. I found him in his room, sitting casually on his bed, like nothing was wrong. I didn't even get a chance to speak before he held up his phone. Relax, he said. I'm not sending this to Dad. Not if you do what I ask. His words hit me like ice water. Ask? I choked out. He didn't blink. You're going to make this worth my while, or this, he tapped his phone, goes straight to him. My entire world tilted. I tried reasoning with him, begging him to delete it, but he just smirked. Nixon wasn't playing games. He knew he had me, and he wasn't afraid to use it. The demands started small. Late-night errands, cash for things he wouldn't explain. But they escalated quickly. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting Edwin. If he found out what I had done, it would destroy him. It would destroy us. But the more Nixon asked, the less I recognized myself. I wasn't Elena anymore. I was his puppet, doing whatever it took to keep my secret buried. And the worst part? Yahir had no idea. The guilt was unbearable. Every time Nixon looked at me, it felt like he was tightening a noose I couldn't escape. But Yahir made it worse. He wasn't the same boy I had tried to comfort all those weeks ago. He was different now, more confident, more possessive. He didn't ask for my attention. He expected it, and I gave it. I hated myself every time, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop when he brushed past me in the kitchen, his hand lingering just a moment too long. I couldn't stop when he waited up for me after Edwin had gone to bed, leaning against the counter with that same look he'd given me in the motel room. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just an illusion, something I'd created out of desperation. But the way Yahir looked at me made it feel real, and Nixon saw it all. One night, after Edwin had fallen asleep, Nixon cornered me in the hallway again. You think no one notices? He said. But I do. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're not as careful as you think. I wanted to slap him, scream at him, but all I could do was stand there, frozen. You know what I want, he said before walking away. I felt sick. The demands grew darker. Nixon wanted more, not just errands or cash. He wanted my time, my attention. And as his demands escalated, so did Yahir's jealousy. He started asking questions about why Nixon suddenly needed so much from me, about why I always looked so tense. I lied again and again. I lied, but Yahir didn't believe me. He started pushing harder, showing up in places he knew Nixon might be watching, like he could sense something was wrong. It didn't help that Edwin had started noticing too. He'd been distracted for so long that I thought he'd never noticed before, but lately he had begun asking about why I seemed so tired, why I was so distracted, and why Nixon had stopped arguing with me. He even asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I couldn't keep up the lie. I couldn't keep pretending. Every time Nixon sent me another text, my heart raced so fast I thought it might stop. Every time Yahir got too close, I felt like I was drowning. I wanted out, but there was no way out. If I told Edwin the truth, I'd lose him, and I'd lose everything. If I gave Nixon what he wanted, I'd lose myself and Yahir. Yahir wasn't letting go. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept repeating, and no matter how many times I woke up, I couldn't escape. I thought I could manage Nixon. I convinced myself that if I gave him just enough to keep him quiet, he would eventually lose interest and let me breathe again. But blackmail doesn't work that way. The more I gave, the more he took. He started texting me late at night, asking me to come to his room just to talk. At first, I thought maybe he wanted to confront me about what I'd done, maybe have a moment of clarity and let it go. But that wasn't it. Nixon wasn't about to let anything go. If anything, he was enjoying it. The power, the control, and I let him. But it wasn't enough for him. Owning my secret wasn't enough. He wanted to push me further, see how far he could go before I broke. And I did. It started with another text. This time, a video clip. I hadn't even opened it before my hand started shaking. I stormed into his room without knocking, slamming the door behind me. I told him it had to stop, that I couldn't take it anymore. But he just laughed. "You're not going anywhere," he said, "unless you want Dad to see this." I don't remember what I said after that. All I know is my voice was loud enough to draw Yahir's attention. He burst through the door, and the look on his face, anger, betrayal, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't even have time to explain before Yahir lunged at Nixon. The room erupted. Yahir was shouting, Nixon was laughing, egging him on, and I just stood there, frozen. By the time I pulled Yahir back, Nixon was smirking like he'd won. "You really thought you could keep this a secret forever?" he said. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly everything spilled out. I told them everything. How it started, why it happened, how I'd let it go too far. I couldn't stop myself. The words kept coming. Like once I started, I couldn't stop. When it was over, Yahir looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. Nixon just stood there, holding his phone like it was a loaded weapon. I'd hoped that telling the truth would make me feel lighter, but it didn't. It just made everything heavier. I tried to act normal, to cook dinner, clean the house, go through the motions like nothing had changed. But Edwin wasn't dumb. I could feel his eyes on me at the table, watching how I flinched when Nixon spoke, or how I couldn't meet Yahir's gaze. "What's going on with you?" he asked later that night. I froze. I told him I was tired, that the trip had worn me out, and he let it go, for the moment. But I knew it wouldn't last. The next morning, he asked again. I snapped at him. I couldn't help it. The pressure was unbearable, and I took it out on him. That's when I saw it, the doubt in his eyes. Edwin had always trusted me, but not anymore. He didn't say anything right away, but I knew he was watching. He noticed how Nixon lingered around me, how Yahir barely spoke to me at dinner. The walls were closing in, and I had no way out. Nixon still had the video. Yahir was hurt and angry, and Edwin was starting to piece things together. I wanted to confess. I wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and tell Edwin everything. Let the truth destroy me so I could finally breathe again. But every time I opened my mouth, fear swallowed the words. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't lose this life I'd built, even if it was built on lies. So I kept pretending. But pretending was exhausting. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time Nixon walked into the room, every time Edwin asked another question. And through it all, Yahir just stared at me, silent, angry, and disappointed. I thought losing Edwin would be the worst part, but losing Yahir felt worse. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it all from falling apart. I thought the worst was over after that night. The screaming, the accusations, the look on Yahir's face when the truth hit him. But the silence that followed, that was worse. Yahir stopped speaking to me entirely. He wouldn't even look at me. He moved through the house like I wasn't there, and every time he walked past me, my stomach dropped. I wanted to fix it, to tell him I was sorry, but I didn't even know where to start. What apology could erase what I'd done? And Nixon? He didn't stop. If anything, the fight with Yahir made him bolder. He knew I couldn't risk pushing him too far, so he used it. Late-night texts, random demands, reminders of what he could do with the video if I didn't give him what he wanted. He'd smile at me across the dinner table, like we shared some secret no one else knew. I hated him for it, but I hated myself more. I couldn't look Edwin in the eyes without feeling like my lies were written across my face. He kept asking questions, little ones at first, like what was wrong, why I seemed so tense, why Yahir barely spoke to me anymore. I kept brushing him off, but the questions didn't stop. He started noticing things. The way Nixon lingered too long when we were alone. The way I flinched every time my phone buzzed. I knew it was only a matter of time before he pieced it all together. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing a bag, walking out the door, and never looking back. But what would that solve? The video would still exist. Nixon would still have control. Yahir would still hate me, and Edwin would still be left to piece together the truth without me there to explain it. I couldn't leave, but I couldn't stay either. Every day felt heavier. Every decision felt wrong, and I was running out of ways to keep pretending. I still don't know how it got this far. I think about that night in the motel room, the moment I could have said no, the moment I could have turned away and kept my life intact. But I didn't, and now I can't take any of it back. Yahir doesn't look at me the same anymore. There's something colder in his eyes, like he's trying to figure out whether he ever really knew me. And Nixon, he still has the video. He still has me. I don't know if he'll ever stop. I don't know if I'll ever be free. And Edwin, he's still asking questions. He's watching me more closely now, noticing the cracks in the story I keep telling him. It's only a matter of time before he finds out the truth. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to confess, to let everything come crashing down and finally stop pretending. But then I think about what I'd lose: my home, my family, everything I've tried so hard to hold on to, and I can't do it. Not yet. So I keep pretending. I keep smiling at the dinner table, folding laundry like nothing's wrong. But inside, I'm unraveling. And the worst part is, I don't know how to stop. So here I am, asking you, anyone, what would you do when everything feels wrong, but the one thing that felt right is the thing you're not supposed to want? When you're torn between fixing what's broken and starting over completely, let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.